My lady, I'm going to turn, if I may, briefly then to the facts and the decision to close schools across the UK. The decision to close schools in each part of the UK, as announced on the 18th of March, had ramifications which are difficult to overstate. At the least, it gave rise to an immediate need to provide education to almost every school child in the UK in their own home. In England, evidence that the Department for Education didn't start planning for the closure of schools until after the 16th of March 2020 is a cause for alarm. Mr. Jonathan Slater, the former Permanent Secretary to the Department for Education, has provided evidence to the inquiry that between January 2020 to the 16th of March 2020, the Department for Education's contingency plans were premised on the assumption that schools and other education settings would remain open, and that, according to him, that was in keeping with the government's overall approach to pandemic preparedness at the time. Sir Gavin Williamson's written evidence is to this same effect. He explains in his words that there was a discombobulating 24-hour sea change from keeping schools open on the 16th of March to discussions about closing schools on the 17th of March. He explains that his focus from February to mid-March was on keeping schools, colleges and other settings open. He did not ask Department for Education officials to prepare an assessment on the impact of school closures because school closures had not been recommended and Number 10 officials had not commissioned this advice from the Department for Education either. According to Mr. Slater, it would clearly have been much better if the Department for Education had been invited to start developing contingency arrangements for closing education settings at an earlier stage in the pandemic, because no contingency plan had been prepared beforehand. Similarly, Sir Gavin Williamson suggests that a reason why the Department for Education did not plan for the closure of schools was that Downing Street had not asked it to. In his statement, the former Prime Minister, Mr. Boris Johnson, takes issue with Sir Gavin Williamson's characterisation of a 24-hour change in approach and suggests that the Department for Education was aware of the possibility of closing schools. His evidence suggests, but it is a matter to be explored with him, that he thought that planning for school closures had been ongoing. My lady, this gives rise to the first of what appear to be some important differences in the evidence of these witnesses. You will hear evidence from Mr. Johnson focused on these apparent disputed facts, and you'll also hear evidence from Professor Sir Chris Whitty as well as to his perspective on the advice that was given as well about the prospect of school closures. 5 years on, why does this matter? My lady, it's my respectful submission that it is significant that there should be any dispute about whether planning for so seismic an event existed, or any lack of understanding on the part of the Prime Minister as to the state of planning for school closures, given that it was he who ultimately made the decision to close schools to most children. And perhaps alarming is the suggestion that it was not for the Department for Education to instigate its own planning for school closures, but to wait for it to be commissioned. And again, I repeat, it's critical because of the implications of closing schools to most children, absent a robust plan as to how the consequences and risks of that decision would start to be mitigated. But of course, it's also important for the future and to potential recommendations about how scientific advice about school closures is provided and interpreted. My lady, that means that Module 8 will ask witnesses about the advice that was being provided by SAGE from the 4th of February 2020 onwards, about the role that mass school closures might play in limiting transmission, and why from this point advice appears not to have prompted the preparation of realistic, detailed plans as to how the consequences of possible mass school closures would be addressed, and that will be considered more in the detail of the hearings. But a draft 3-page note from the Department for Education of the 15th of March, which the inquiry understands was finalised and provided to the Cabinet Office, set out the stark headline implications of universal school closures in England, which now needed to be confronted. They included that almost 9 million pupils could not be guaranteed to receive an education for the time their school closed, that remote learning would not work for all, because schools' ability to provide it would be hugely variable and many children didn't have access to the relevant kit. And many didn't live in adequate home environments, that the most vulnerable children were much safer in school than out of school, that parents and siblings of children with special needs or disabilities would face a higher burden of care.